Fouad Siniora, former Prime Minister of Lebanon. I have 1,000 questions for you after that speech. I hope I get to ask 3 or 4 of them during the panel. Thank you very much for the keynote address. As you know, it's not only going to be Fouad Siniora up on stage. We have a panel of distinguished guests, and I'm going to invite them one by one to take their seats before we begin the discussion with them. Let me begin by calling up Ibrahim Kalın, who is Special Advisor to President Erdogan and spokesman for the presidency. So, thank you. Take a seat. Here you are. You'll be playing a central midfield role today.
Fine.
Next to Ibrahim Kalın, I'd like to invite the man we know as, in his most recent and I guess most popular, unfortunately, incarnation over the past few years, as the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Stafan de Mistura. As an example of how serious Syria is and how ongoing it is, I think he had to take a call related to work, so we will bring him back in a moment, as soon as he is ready. Maha Yahya, who is the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center, will be joining us as well. Maha. Yes. Actually, it's Mr. Mistura, so we can say thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes.
We have a lot of diplomats on our panel today, and it's a good opportunity to hear from their experiences. I would also like to invite the former ambassador of the Organization of Islamic Conference to the United Nations, among other roles, Mokhtar Lamani.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Welcome, please. Have a seat.
Hello.
Sir.
How are you? I'm sorry.
Thank you. No problem. Please, have a seat.
Lovely to see you. Lovely to see you. Helen.
We have a lot of time to discuss amongst ourselves, amongst each other. I would love to have the opportunity to have some lateral thinking amongst everybody here on the panel. I know that it's a rare opportunity to have people with such diverse backgrounds and experiences, especially related to conflict, all on the same stage, all at the exact moment getting to hear each other and respond to each other. And I thank Fouad Siniora for setting the stage for us and setting, I guess, a paradigm for us from which to build upon.
Yes.
And when you said what to do, you let it hang for a little bit. Because that's what we're trying to figure out, right? So do you think at the end of this hour we'll be able to figure it out?
Well, actually, the time has come that everybody has to ask this question. I mean, whether they are politicians, whether they are non-state actors, whether they are regional powers or international powers, because this is the beginning. We are in the midst of a period in which I believe that every party, everybody is losing from the continuation of war and confrontation. And we have started to see the symptoms of the impact of what's happening in the Middle East in the streets of the various international powers. And this is creating much of a change that we are going to see more and more of that.
We are in a state of uncertainty. I think everybody can accept that and understand that. And to begin our discussion, I'd like to invite Ibrahim Kalın to say a few words, especially given that Turkey is seen by many as a sort of balancer, the furthest east of the west, the furthest west of the east. It's in the middle of everything. Ibrahim Kalın.
Thank you, Imran. Good morning to you all, and thank Prime Minister for a wonderful speech. I want to begin with the words of and greetings of peace, salam, because we're talking about security, insecurity. I cannot imagine a situation where we will have peace or security, safety for all, without at least thinking about what peace means. When we say peace, we also say peace be upon you. That is, we do not leave the word peace out in the middle. In fact, we say peace from us to you. And it's more than just peace, obviously, in the political sense of the term. It's peace within our souls, it's peace in the world, and it comes from high on, actually. It's one of the divine names, as-salam. The reason I want to emphasize this aspect of peace is that every time we talk about the region, so-called region, the Middle East, immediately what we think of is war, conflict, economic deprivation, occupation, civil wars, conflict, and so on and so forth. That has not been the story of the Middle East or the Middle Islamic world until about a century ago. In fact, this part of the world has produced some of the most enduring achievements of Islam, world culture and civilization, in philosophy, in science, in education, in architecture, in many, many other fields. When you talk about Baghdad, Basra, or many parts of what we call the Middle East today, Damascus and other places, you go back a few centuries before and you see the luminaries of the world in many different fields of human knowledge have either come from this part of the world or have come to this part of the world to produce culture, science for all. And of course, we live in the age of insecurity because I will talk about this in more political terms, but there is a sense of insecurity that comes from this conflict between heaven and earth, between ourselves, within our souls, because without making peace with the heavens, we cannot establish peace and security on earth. I know this is maybe too philosophical for this panel, but I wanted to emphasize this especially because the world feels insecure in the face of growing unilateralism, growing or rising racism. The might is right approach, that I am powerful, therefore I am right approach. That's what causes insecurity in the world. I feel insecure when I hear some world leaders or political leaders saying that I am superior to you because I have X, Y, Z. The world feels insecure when the leader of the most powerful country in the nation says to another sovereign nation that you wouldn't survive without us for 2 weeks. Yes. The world feels insecure about these things. And one has to take responsibility, and one has to take this sort of political posturing to task before we talk about security in the Middle East, security in the Gulf, security here and there. The problem of security is a global problem. It's not just about Muslim countries, it's not just about Muslim nations or the Middle East. I feel very insecure when I see the rising tide of Islamophobia in Europe, when in fact Muslim minorities have tried their best to integrate into the societies in which they live. They follow the laws and rules and regulations of the countries in which they live. They contribute to that society. They speak the language. They know the culture, history, and everything, but they are still seen as outcasts. They are still seen as troublemakers, and they are still stereotyped. They are still stigmatized. They are still alienated from the larger society. I mean, I think a recent example was the German-Turkish football player Mesut Özil, when he had to give up his role as a player in the national team because he felt so much pressure from racist circles. How much time have we really spent on this issue? Now, what does that mean really for the kind of global peace that we want to establish in the world today? Just a few days, just a few pieces, just a few comments, and we leave it behind. But there is such a deep-rooted racism there that Mesut Özil, someone like him, who is not a politician, who is not an intellectual, who is not a political figure of any kind, he's just a very successful football player, but he felt that racism coming over him from all corners, and he had to come out and make a very, very intelligent, very strong statement about this. We do not pay attention to these things. We just think that, okay, next headline, you know, we have exhausted this, now we can move on to the next headline. But that's not, I don't think it is unrelated to the suffering that we see in Syria, in Iraq, or disorder or insecurity that we see in Africa or in Southeast Asia or in other parts of the world. If we are living in a global world, and if everything is integrated, interdependent in this world in which we live, then we have to look at it from a more holistic point of view to address these issues. Therefore, in my opening remarks, I'll just conclude by saying that, yes, we have a problem of security. It's not just in the Middle East. It's everywhere. In fact, it is generated by the failures of regional countries, no doubt, and regional actors, but it's also exacerbated by the global power disequilibrium that we are seeing in the world today. You cannot establish order in any part of the world or impose it from outside if you do not have regional ownership. And if you are imposing your own one-sided agenda on any conflict, on any part of the world, whether it's in Africa or in Latin America or in Southeast Asia, you will end up in failure. We already have this problem of failing states, weak states, at least in our region. And look at, for example, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, even Lebanon to a certain extent. You have a problem of governance. You don't have strong governments to establish public order, to follow policies that will set the course for that country for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And you have the rise of non-state actors. You have the problem of other political actors deciding on the future of the region. But who is supporting this state of affairs? Who is benefiting from this? And if you look at it from this point of view, I think there is much to talk about. So when we talk about peace and security in the Middle East or in a fragmented world, I think the emphasis should be as much on the region as it should be on the larger world in which we live.
It's really fascinating, Ibrahim Kalın, trying to find the common thread between, and it sounds bizarre initially, between the barrel bombs and occupation and also the racism that Özil faced, all being part of the same pot of instability and fragmentation. And we'll circle back to that as we discuss what to do next. And we're also going to circle back to Stafan de Mistura in a few moments, but I want to bring in Maha for now. Maha Yahya, paint the picture for us. What is this? We look up here, regional players and the shift. What are we talking about? What's the problem?
That's a hard act to follow after Prime Minister Siniora's speech, which I think painted a pretty interesting picture in terms of what is happening today. We're in a situation where there are at least 4 major conflicts in the region, Libya, Yemen, Syria, which actually, to my mind, has become the linchpin of instability across the region. Syria was a key player in the region. It is now the stage on which much of regional and global instability is played out in or on. We also have, well, Iraq, thankfully, seems to be at least moving, has taken one step in the right direction with the election of President Barham Saleh and the appointment of a new prime minister. We also have the long-standing occupation of Palestinian territories. So overall, the prospects for the incoming future, this is at the kind of more political global level. At the more societal level and socioeconomic level, this is a region that is facing declining economic growth. The end of the rentier state is very much there. The rentier state was or rentier relationships, or what marked the relationships between states and their citizens over decades, where citizens willingly gave up, or at least were encouraged to give up political rights in exchange for social welfare. This is over now. We're seeing policies being implemented across the region that are removing subsidies on a large number of goods. The people that are being impacted by this directly are the poorest of the poor. So violence, increasing violence at very different societal level. We constantly talk about non-state actors and what they're doing, but there's also state violence. What we're seeing in Egypt today is also very disconcerting, to say the least. The kind of clampdown, the emboldening of autocratic tendencies across the region is very evident. So at every different level, I think we're moving towards a very worrisome future that can only get worse if we continue along this path. I think what is needed today is for most regional players to at least come to the recognition that enough is enough, and that if we continue along this path, everybody is going to lose. Right now, I believe it's mainly the people of the region who are losing. Today, the biggest victims in Syria are the Syrians. It's not anyone else. They are paying the heaviest price for a war that they no longer control. Not sure they controlled it from the beginning, but it's a war that they no longer have any control over. So I think there's a point where regional players and international players have to come to the recognition that continued instability, a political settlement that is not a just political settlement, that is not acceptable, to a broad swath of the population, is one that will only sow the seeds of conflict for a very long time to come. I would say the same for in Palestine. If there isn't a political settlement that recognizes the right of Palestinians, we're also sowing the seeds of conflict for a very long time to come. So a recognition, a building up on common interests, a vested interest in at least making this region work again.
Right.
I'll stop here.
Certainly. Peace with justice. And I mean, the UN Special Envoy to Syria sitting next to you nodding, right? That's everything he's trying to do right now, to get enough people to agree that this is a way forward. I think everybody here agrees that enough is enough. How do we figure that out? That's the big challenge. Let's...
If I could just say, I mean, yes. It's not rocket science as such. We can't...
So why are we so terrible at it?
Sorry?
Why are we so terrible at it, all of us?
I think because there still isn't the common recognition. If you look at a place like Syria, where there are so many vested interests today, and very competing interests, there still isn't a recognition amongst everybody who has a finger in that pie, that it is in their collective interest to make sure that Syria stabilizes. If we're looking at a political settlement, for example, that does not recognize the right of return to refugees, a safe return in dignity, then we're sowing the seeds of instability for a very long time.
Understood. And I think, just for the sake of clarity here, I want to get some opening comments from Mokhtar Lamani as well, and then Stafan de Mistura, and then we're going to open it up, and you guys can jump in at any time you want to interrupt each other, if you like, as well. Interrupt me, tell me to be quiet. You want to talk amongst yourselves. I want to bring in Mokhtar Lamani. Mokhtar Lamani, you've heard a little bit from the other distinguished guests. Tell me, what does this mean, the shifting security situation? What is all this fragmentation? What is all this instability?
Well, thank you. And to avoid repeating what was said by some of the colleagues, where I totally agree, I would like much more to concentrate on the nature of this kind of new crisis that I was living through my own experience in both when I was Special Envoy in Iraq in 2006, as well as when I served as the director of the UN mission in Syria, making a lot of work on the ground and to see the differences that exist between the ground and the diplomatic meetings. That's a huge difference. First of all, both crises, you know, Iraq as well as Syria, even the beginning is different, and Iraq was after the American invasion. Syria was much more linked to the Arab Spring, but they have some commonalities, mainly three characteristics to this crisis. The first one, that this society became strongly fragmented, and the fragmentation is not only political, it's taking a social dimension. With this fragmentation, one of my duties when I was in Damascus, and I used to go every Saturday to a different area to meet with the armed groups, we were trying to have a database of all the names that we heard as brigades. Of course, brigades in Syria with the armed group has no military definition. It can be 5 people as well as 30,000 people. At that time, we counted more than 2,000 names, you know, just to give an example about this kind of fragmentation. Then a second thing in both countries, which is much more inherited from the nature of the regime of the two countries, security regimes, is a very high level of mistrust between people themselves of the country. When I tried to organize the meeting for the Iraqis in Cairo for national reconciliation, I realized how this level was very high. The three other, they ended by having 3 dimensions, this crisis. They exist at the local, regional, and international thing. What are the results of this kind of crisis? Some are really scaring me. I remember when I used to be ambassador to the UN, it happened during the time of Boutros Ghali, you know, the genocide of Srebrenica, as well during the time of Kofi Annan, Rwanda. The following the Insecurity Council, everybody was taken by surprise. But you can see sometimes the ingredient for a kind of genocide. And I was a witness in Syria, as well as in Iraq, to see one of the most dangerous things, sectarianism. Things are moving very strongly to sectarianism, to push people even to identify themselves according to sectarianism than national dimension. There's also the danger of a disintegration of the country, and they ended by having a kind of wars by proxy, and nothing is working. If you see, as it was mentioned about Syria, the Syrians don't play any act. They are not actors anymore now. With all the interventions, what is going to happen? Are they going to stay in the same state? Or how, especially when I link it to the question of sectarianism, how things are going to be in 10 or 20 years? And when you link it to the problems that exist now between Saudi Arabia and Iran, with that sectarian dimension, not only, even when you include the final decision of the Israeli to have a Jewish state, you know, a religious, in a way, kind of religious state, where are we going in this part of the world? It's really scary, in which you see that even the notion of the state as it was done after Sykes-Picot, is it the end of it? Are we going, where are we moving? I'm scared. I'm going to stop here and to develop. I have a lot of things, but I would like to end with one single thing. We're witnessing during the 90s a new notion in international law of failed state, what was happening in Somalia and some parts of Africa. When I linked Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, all the kind of problems, are we going to be talking in the coming years or months about a failed region? The whole region is failed. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a scathing indictment of the entire region, that you're actually asking that question just a few years after everybody had this incredible hope of the Arab Spring. It was like a big movie for all of us. We thought, like, one after the other, every country is just going to domino to democracy and freedom, and people are going to overthrow dictators, and everything's going to be wonderful. One place where it's clearly not wonderful, it's horrendous, and it has been horrendous for more than 7 years, is Syria. Stafan de Mistura, unfortunately, you are the face of, I don't want to use the word failed, but attempts to fix it that have not worked. You are the face of things being unresolved in Syria right now. When we see you on the TV, we know you're still trying, and this war's still going. What does that mean when we look at the shifting security situation, and is Syria at the heart of all of that?
First of all, let me start by saying what I've heard is very much something I share, so I will enter from a different point. Second, yes, I am the image, the person who is representing the constant attempts by the international community, so far not achieving what they want, but also, let me be frank, also the constant determination of the international community and the countries who are part of it to not abandon Syria and just to say, Malesh, never mind, we continue this military solution, which apparently was the aim at the beginning. Remember, mediation is based on the fact that there is a stalemate. In other words, two sides who are finding themselves in a moment when they need a mediator in order to try to find a common ground. That has been overcome by the fact that while everyone has been saying there is no military solution, there is only a political solution, the truth is that we have seen certainly a military advances and a military attempt to solve this conflict. Now, so let me address the point which I think is the most crucial one. I'm in the middle of it, so operationally. Timing. Timing is everything in life, in love, in friendship, in war, in peace. Timing is now. Why? Because we are getting not anymore in proxy war. Proxy war is over. Look at it. Look how many countries, how many armies are involved directly inside Syria today. Should I just mention 5? They're all there, and in fact, the regional and international potential of a direct misunderstanding is enormous. That is dangerous, that is bad, but there's also potentially an opportunity for a wake-up call. And the wake-up call is taking place. You want an example? I would say what happened in Idlib, a very, very dangerous moment. We all saw this as the last major, potentially catastrophic battle, the mother of all battles for the conflict of Syria. 3 million people. On the other side, 10,000 terrorists, but 3 million people. In a combination, I must say, and we have to welcome it and support it, of a cocktail, which obviously is non-alcoholic cocktail, naturally, of a combination of diplomatic and political negotiations, difficult ones, which took place between Turkey and Russia. Let's call them by name because they are the ones who actually came up with, which then was combined with reality check on the fact that this could have been a terrible, catastrophic humanitarian catastrophe with 3 million people moving. Turkey has got already very generously been handling 3 million people themselves. Another 3 million? At the very time when some countries are saying it's time for refugees to return and for rehabilitation to start, at the very time you have new 2 million refugees? Not sustainable. And when the bombing would take place, and then you're talking about rehabilitation, not sustainable. And all that in front of the General Assembly, timing, and all that when you had that major social mobilization, public opinion saying we cannot see another 3 times, 5 times what we saw in Aleppo, in Eastern Ghouta and elsewhere, and on top of it, local people, women, civilians, mobilizing themselves inside Idlib, showing the candlelights on the doors and saying, we are people, we are not terrorists, and 1 million children there, we are children, not terrorists, help to create what I think needs to be sustained. So timing, October, November, are crucial for making sure that Idlib never becomes the final battle, but becomes instead the opportunity, a window of opportunity for what? A political process. Now, where are we in the political process? That's the right question. Well, we had and we have 2254, but let's be frank, realpolitik is also taking over. And realpolitik has always been the reality when you get at the end of a conflict. So now that has been focusing on one area, Constitutional Committee. Is that a small area? Crucial. Through the Constitution, as you know, that's when you actually make changes. That's when you discuss everything. The tenure of a president, the way you organize elections, the separation of power. So it's fundamental, and that one is the last but crucial element which can be linking a solution, what we call political solution. And timing, October, November again. So bottom line, this is a moment when we have to support the Idlib MOU. It needs to be sustained and kept alive because it gives us the feeling and the wind of opportunity to avoiding that the war ends with a war and starts instead with a new process called Constitutional Committee.
Tremendous optimism from you still.
Determination.
Determination. And,
yeah.
you know, for many, you'll see Idlib as a small victory that is a harbinger of better things to come. For others, maybe a Band-Aid or a temporary pause. People have seen this movie before, that's why they're cynical. And allow me then to bring in Ibrahim Kalın. For those who would say, fantastic, congratulations, Turkey, for making a deal with the Russians and the Iranians and so forth, stopping the killing for now. But as we mentioned, peace and justice. Are we sacrificing justice for peace? Does this mean that Assad doesn't face justice for his barrel bombs, that Russia doesn't get to be questioned about their role during the war? For millions of Syrians, that would be unacceptable. Is realpolitik at the heart of moving forward and making peace? Do you have to make these uncomfortable deals?
Well, let me jump on that,
sure,
if I may, because you're raising an important point. Frankly, first thing first, okay? Ask the Syrians. They want the end of this horror. 5 million refugees, 3 million here. 450, 500,000 people killed. I don't want to tell you how many wounded, how many displaced people, how many people who have been suffering out of it. They want the end of this conflict, point one. We need to work on that. Point number two, I think President Karzai must be here, or he was certainly around. He will remind us how at a certain point transitional justice is crucial. But if you put it up front, then you end up actually complicating the whole process. It must be there, like a candlelight, always open. What we need is confidence-building measures. What happens to the detainees? 100,000 of them. We have no news of them. Not one of them has been released. What about law number 10? What about the reassurance to the people that if they do return, and they love their country to return, they will not be arrested. They will not be sent to be part of the military, which they will also be able to regain their own home and dignity. Again, Constitutional Committee. Constitution can help on that.
I fully agree with the importance of the crucial piece in the Syrian process, which is the Constitutional Committee, and we are working very hard with His Excellency de Mistura, as well as other stakeholders in both the Geneva and the Astana processes. In regards to the Idlib agreement, it is certainly the best news we have had recently coming out of the Syrian picture. And it's really thanks to the tireless efforts of our President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, to make this happen. Really, he weighed in, he put in his weight, really, to get that agreement out of Sochi, and the whole world is, I think, has acknowledged the importance of the Idlib agreement. But obviously, Turkey cannot carry this burden on its own. Other international players, the international community has to take responsibility. It's not enough just to say, well, Turkey, you've done a great job, thank you, and then just, you know, go on with business as usual. The problem gets bigger and deeper by the day, and you see this shifting policies of key players in Syria, from United States to European countries to Gulf countries and others. And that creates not only confusion, but also a lot of chaos on the ground. What I mean by this is the following. United States said at one point that their goal in Syria is to fight Daesh, is to eliminate ISIS. Once Daesh was eliminated, largely, they had to come up with another excuse or reason to stay in Syria. And it gradually evolved to a point where the American military presence in Syria is no longer about Daesh, because, as they said, it has largely been defeated. And in the meantime, they continue to engage and support PYD-YPG, which is PKK Syria branch, which actually poses a threat, a direct threat to our national security. Now they are saying that, well, they have to make sure that Daesh is defeated in an enduring way. The enduring defeat of Daesh is the primary goal. But we know that deep down, that's not the main reason. The main reason is now to establish a military presence against Iran in Syria. Now you have, I agree, we have gone beyond the proxy war stage here. Actually, you have this country is now facing each other, if not fighting physically, in Syria. Therefore, nobody is talking about the Syrian people anymore. You're talking about the interests of great powers through the Syrian territories and on the shoulders of the Syrian people. And this is really so inhumane. This is so unethical when you look at it from this point of view, that even though we talk about there is no military solution, it's all about political solution. To be honest with you, those who say this are the ones that continue the war on the field, from the regime to others. So we have a big problem there. But the bottom line, I think, is the fact that a sustainable peace is possible only when it is based on justice. You have this principle in the case of Palestine. Why we don't have a lasting peace or sustainable, enduring peace in Palestine? Because all the options that have been offered so far in regards to the Palestinian questions have lacked one basic principle, and that is the principle of justice. What they propose is that occupation should continue under different guises. That's not justice. The Palestinians will never accept it. We will never accept it. And I think the countries and the nations and the communities of the world with conscience will never accept it. But Israel is trying to impose this policy for many, many years. Now they have a very good partner at the White House, which gives them a green card or carte blanche on every single issue, from moving U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, to cutting aid to UNRWA, the Palestinian refugees, to basically presenting the Palestinians as the culprits, as troublemakers, as spoilers, and then again. So blaming the victim has been the game of the Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, and now they're repeating this through Washington. And of course, it's not going to lead to peace or sustainable peace. Anthony Shadid, some of you may remember, may God bless his soul, who was a brilliant journalist from Lebanon, who unfortunately died in a very unfortunate incident 5-6 years ago, was a dear friend, a wonderful human being, who covered the Middle East for many, many years for the Washington Post, New York Times, etc., won prizes as a journalist. He wrote a wonderful book, 2 books actually, he published before he died, and his last book was published posthumously. And it's called Stonehouse, actually. It talks about the story of his family in Lebanon. A wonderful book, a great writer. I strongly recommend him to all of you. He said in his book, I think it was The Night Draws Near. It's that book, I think. It talks about the Middle East. This was before the Syrian war, where he says, every time you go in the Middle East, you will hear one word which is of key significance to understand political culture in Arab societies. You may not hear the word democracy all the time. You may not hear the word freedom all the time. You may not hear the word civil liberties all the time, but you will hear one word coming up over and over again in every circle, in every discussion, at every level, and that's the word adl, justice. Without justice, you will never understand the region. You will never establish sustainable peace. So when we talk about the Syrian conflict, the political turmoil in Iraq or Yemen or in Palestine, without justice, we cannot have peace in any part. It will be a superficial, temporary imposition of the interest of certain nation states rather than a peace that is sustainable because it is based on justice.
Fouad Siniora.
Thank you very much. I would like to share with you two observations that are interesting. The first one, actually nature has taught us a lesson, but we never admit that. Everybody started hearing during the past 2 decades about something called birds flu. Birds flu is transmitted by these birds, actually, who can cross the frontiers without asking for a visa. And they move from one country to another. It is exactly like factors pertaining to violence and prosperity at the same time. Violence, terrorism, it is transmitted in one way or another without asking a visa from any of the concerned countries. And if and when you work towards prosperity, again, this can be transmitted in one way or another to your neighbors. The second observation, in physics we learned about, what do you call it, theory of connected vessels. When you exert a certain pressure on something, you tend to think that you have released that pressure. Probably, this is your first reaction or what you can see. But effectively, that pressure is transmitted somewhere else to appear in a different form, a different shape, and taking, let's say, different dimensions at the same time. Coming back to our topic and benefiting from these two concepts, I would say. Compromising justice for peace, you end in losing both. In losing both. Actually, what has been going on is that we are fond of having what you call it quick fixes. But quick fixes never provide solutions to people. At a time when we are talking about basic matters and important matters, when the region is really losing confidence in international organizations, because international organizations issue international resolutions of the Security Council, of the United Nations, and many are really trying to really destroy them, and they are never implemented. So people are getting really less and less confident in international organizations. Hence, the latest thing, what we have seen by decisions making by the US administration, which is contrary to international resolutions, contrary to the established principles and policies of the United States and the decisions taken by the United States over a number of decades, they are being shattered in one way or another. And hence, people, they want long-term solutions. And basically, they want effectively solutions, particularly to let's say, the problem of Jerusalem. Now, things are getting really very difficult in matters pertaining to Jerusalem and touches the conscience, the inner feelings of people everywhere. I mean, because it is related to all religions, to the Jews, to the Christians, and to the Muslims. And all of them, they, in one way or another, they are being affected. Probably you are not getting the right response now, but it is really in them. And you just wait for a split of a second that might change, and you'll find that it is really exploding. So this is what I really believe, that the region is really suffering from something. And the world has started to really be affected in one way or another through these changes that we are noticing in many European countries and in the States. And the whole theory that President Trump is coming up is based actually as a reaction to what's happening in the rest of the world. So that's what I believe, that we end up in looking at things the right way and try to find real sustainable solutions.
For the sake of timing, I don't want to follow up on Eritrea and Ethiopia with you, but something to chew on. I want to ask, and maybe you can fold it into one of your final comments. You mentioned Eritrea and Ethiopia as a model for the Middle East, or you see it as being something positive. My question is, who is the Abiy Ahmed of the Middle East? Who's that person extending the olive branch in order to bring about peace in the region, as we saw with Ethiopia's new prime minister to the Eritreans, to say, yes, we had injustices in the past, I'm willing to overlook it, let's move forward. Something to think about. I want to bring Maha in. Maha?
I'm glad you brought up this question, because just in response to what was being said earlier, and I agree with almost everything that was said, yes, people in Syria, but also in the region, do want an end to conflict, but they also want leadership and vision. So we don't have the other one who is, at least at this point, who's able to extend that olive branch, not in Syria, and unfortunately not in other places, at least none that I can pinpoint. I want to just go back to the issue of, and what Prime Minister Siniora said about, no, you cannot have peace without justice. If you sacrifice justice for peace, you end up losing both. For Syria, the Constitutional Committee is not the kind of, the linchpin. It's not the golden, the answer to everything. I think there are a lot of other things that can be done as the Constitutional Committee is going on. And even the credibility of the Constitution that comes out of this is going to have a lot of question marks around it. Because when you're drawing up a constitution in an environment where there's a victor-vanquished mentality, where there are very little concessions to be made, and where the process of putting together the constitution is, for many people, a big question mark. I mean, look at South Africa and the way that constitution was put through. You need buy-in. People need to believe in this constitution. So I think it's very important for Syrians to have the possibility of inputting, and I mean large numbers of Syrians, not just those who are actually working on this in the current environment. The right of return for refugees is, I think, fundamentally important. It does not need to be tied in. You mentioned a lot of the issues that are related to the right of return, i.e. protection, law number 10, the military conscription, the ability to go back home without being persecuted. These are fundamental conditions that for Syrians, if they don't have international guarantees that someone is going to be there to protect them from being detained, from being killed, they won't go back. They simply won't go back. The issue of transitional justice, I don't think we can postpone it. It's something that needs to be on the table and needs to be discussed. When you talk to ordinary refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, wherever you are, they say it's important. We need to know that there will be some accountability. I don't care. I've talked to refugees who will say, I don't care to hold the person who stole my house accountable. I understand that will not happen. They distinguish between different levels of accountability, but they do want those that murdered their families held accountable. So I think these issues are important in the here and now, even as there is a realpolitik that is painting the whole thing. But without a real discussion on the issue, detainees, I know there's been quite a move on the issue of detainees, and they disappeared. We already heard that 10,000 young individuals from Dar'a who had disappeared apparently were killed so it is important to continue moving forward on these issues, but without losing sight that questions of justice, but also international guarantees for people are also equally important, I think.
Stafan de Mistura, you...
I definitely have no problem at all. In fact, we are saying the same thing. The matter is priorities as well. And I think, again, I'm sorry I'm being very pragmatic, timing. And the timing is, if we miss this window of opportunity of Idlib sustaining the MOU that has been courageously done and difficult to implement, we have to say Turkey has quite a challenge, and we need to help Turkey because most of the burden of the Idlib MOU is on Turkey, to squaring a circle that no one has been able to square so far since at least the last 5 years, to be able to combine the fact, how do you handle terrorists and at the same time make sure that 3 million people are not involved or paying a price for what is unavoidably a need to address. So timing there, and the second timing is a combination of what we heard. Constitutional Committee is not the solution of everything, but it is the icebreaker, is the entry point, is the way through which you enter the DNA of a political solution, because it does include all what we mentioned and needs to be accompanied by all of this. Having a Constitutional Committee meeting in Geneva is not enough. It needs to be accompanied by all that. Otherwise, people will not believe in it. But we need to start, and the timing is now during this window of opportunity. If we miss it, we go back to the military solution. That means perhaps military territorial victory, but no victory of peace, and no sustainability of peace. That means no rehabilitation, reconstruction, return of refugees, and a country divided. No way.
Right. Mokhtar Lamani, who is one of the big issues here, and we've got 10 minutes, so apologies. I'm going to have to sort of rush through this a little bit and get final comments from everybody. There's a fundamental disagreement among many people as to who the source of the insecurity might be. So, for example, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, sir, but in your speech you pinpointed Iran a lot as being a source of instability in the region. To another entire section and segment of the Middle East, the source of the instability is Saudi Arabia and their access and so forth. So can we ever solve any of this without the fundamental parameters being agreed upon? One side believes Iran's the source of the trouble, the other Saudi and its allies.
Okay, let me begin with the example that was given about the relation between Ethiopia and the region, Djibouti or the others. Well, those were problems between states. What we are facing in the Middle East, it's inside each state, you know. And the approach on the ground, it's so far from again and again from the diplomatic conferences. Why? I'm going to tell you, when the Russians and the Americans, and when I used to go to Geneva, I told them this, agreed about having Geneva to settle the question of Syria, for both Lavrov as well as Kerry, it became an objective. Lavrov said, okay, I'm going to bring the Syrian government, and the Americans were going to bring the opposition, and we are going to have Geneva like an objective. What I was witnessing inside Damascus, the government doesn't want to go to Geneva, said if we are going to go just to please the Russian, there's no political will, and the armed group I used to go, I have a list of the people of the the opposition outside Syria, telling whom of these names you think represent you. I was so shocked to hear all the time, you know, these people, if they come to see us, we will slaughter them. This is part of the reality. Even within these conferences, if they reach an agreement, how are you going to implement it? The other thing, which is also very, very dangerous, and I mentioned in the beginning sectarianism. Why? And I'm going to talk about Iran and Saudi Arabia in this specific issue. When the Syrians made the huge mistake to open the doors of their country to a foreign intervention, the groups I used to visit, they were 100% Sunni. And the militia that they were brought from Lebanon, as well as from Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iraq, the Nujaba, were 100% Shia. And when you ask the people inside the country to see this kind of crisis, look in the example of Iraq when they asked the Kurds, they wanted to have independence. It's for some regional stability that they were prevented from having their own independence. And in my view, the problem is much more complicated and more dangerous, and I'm scared about the future.
Oh, no. Is there any silver lining for you? And what I'm going to do now is I'm sort of going to go person by person, untold me. So we'll start with you, sir. Is there any silver lining for you? Is there anything you're optimistic about?
It's very hard to, it's very, very hard to say. One of the reasons why it's hard to say, because the conflicting agendas that exist locally, regionally, and internationally, and still a lot of actors, they think of winning. And it's just a game by these conferences.
Maha Yahya, we'll come along, yes.
The people of the region. The people of the region. I think what we saw in 2011, I'm going to go down from the stratosphere to the ground. What we saw in 2011 is a people that across the region in different countries that got up and said enough. We do have a right to freedom, to prosperity, to all of these things. Despite all the bloodshed.
But it failed.
It didn't, despite all the bloodshed, the amount of energy you still see on the ground today amongst Syrians, amongst Tunisians, amongst Egyptians, amongst Palestinians, and the harshest of conditions is quite inspiring. They haven't given up on their own societies or their own countries. They're trying to make do with what they can and influence where they can. I don't think we can afford to give up on them either. That's the only silver lining I see today. Will they be able to, it's very romantic perhaps, will they be able to push back against in a situation where, as Mokhtar just said, the vested interests of all the actors mean that they're not willing to work towards a regional or even a local comprehensive solution? It's a big question, but for me that's the only silver lining I see at this point.
The people. Stafan de Mistura?
Well, first of all, a comment. I agree. In fact, what is keeping us going, the UN and those who believe in a political solution, are the Syrian people. And frankly, Syrian women in particular. We have a huge energy, positive energy coming from them saying, don't abandon us. Now, silver lining, the bad news first. The bad news is that we have never been so close to the potential, if this does not proceed in the right direction, to a direct military confrontation among countries, big countries, armies. So the potential of what has been a Syrian tragedy to become more than a regional tragedy, perhaps even global, is there. Think about the potential incidents which have taken place or could take place. So that's the bad news, but that's also the wake up for the good news. Now is the best timing for capitalizing on what has been done in Idlib in order to actually turn this danger into an opportunity.
I'm running out of time. Look, we've got 3 minutes if you look at that clock over there. So
just one sentence.
Certainly.
One sentence only. Just people will be the guarantors of any peace that comes about. That's all.
People will be the guarantors. Yeah. Ibrahim Kalın?
Well, in the short run, certainly we will continue to support the Geneva process led by His Excellency Mr. de Mistura. We will continue to work in the Astana process and bring them closer to one another. But I think in the long run, there are some important steps we have to take, hopefully once we reach that point of political resolution. And that's where hope lies. I think we have lots of problems. It's difficult times in the region, no doubt. We are going through a big storm in the modern history of the Middle East. But remember, the great Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius said in his meditations once, while he was fighting in Germania against the German tribes, that the true leadership is tested when you go through a storm. You stand your ground and you knowing that fully one day that storm will be over. And if you are still standing and upholding your principles and values in which you believe, then you have really won the battle, the real battle. Now, I think you look at the Syrian people, you look at other communities in the larger Muslim world in the Middle East, they show remarkable resilience. They, I believe, despite all these difficulties, have a sense of optimism for the future in a very different sense. You look at some of the Western societies, nihilism, the sense of senselessness, the loss of meaning is much deeper. despite enormous economic privileges, despite development, despite political stability, you have this very deep-rooted psychology of no hope for the future. But in the middle of all these difficulties and conflicts that you see in the Muslim world, in the Middle East and other places, you ask anyone who's just come from the battleground, they will tell you something silver lining about their future. We obviously have to help them to make it happen, to help them realize their dreams. But I agree, it takes political leadership. We don't have much of it. We need political wisdom. We lack it. We need political determination. We suffer from its absence. But I think giving all this, I personally have a lot of hope for our future. 20 years from now on, 50 years from now on, maybe our children, our grandchildren, inshallah, will see and will help build a better world, not just in the Middle East, but in the entire world.
I would love to be moderating here someday where our topic is 10 years of peace and prosperity. Is our life meaningless? Things are too good. War is over. Fouad Siniora, very finely.
2 minutes from your time. Yes.
Certainly.
Yes. Well, each one of us actually has a duty and has a responsibility, and more actually among the leaders, which I share, Ibrahim, that we lack leadership, we lack wisdom, and we lack determination. But nevertheless, we should really create hope for our people and not to throw them in despair, because this is even much more dangerous. Definitely not false hope, because, I mean, this concept of pessimism and optimism is a state of mind. We have to really work hard in order to create real hope and a real determination to pursue it, and a strong commitment towards that. Otherwise, we are sending our people, our communities, into a much deeper hole than they are in at the present time. Definitely, this requires real reform within our societies. And I already hinted a lot in my speech about reform and the religious discourse and so on and so forth, actually, and stating about the importance of these concepts. I would like to end up by saying two things. One thing, I would like to borrow it from my experience in the field of finance, my prior experience. They say in the field of finance, you cannot appoint the manager who was responsible for the bankruptcy of the company to be in charge of rescuing it. Secondly, it's a saying by Einstein that he says, you cannot solve your problems by using the same thinking that you used when you created them. Mm-hmm. Let's think of it. And let's work hard to regain hope and determination. And nevertheless, I am hopeful that we will reach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could we give a warm round of applause to everybody on the panel? The former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Fouad Siniora, to Ibrahim Kalın, Turkey's presidential spokesman, Stafan de Mistura, Maha Yahya, and Mokhtar Lamani. Another round of applause, please, to all of them. Don't go anywhere, because the next session will be starting in just over 5 minutes. My colleague David Foster will be with you. If everybody didn't get the best opportunity to express their views, the fault is all my own. I apologize. But I think we had an interesting medley of thoughts here. It was wise, it was humble, it was dignified, and really informative. And I thank you all once again. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Appreciate it.